Ein Harod, where supposedly Gideon was given his 300 men. And we were wearing these bright yellow shirts that looked like big bananas, and they said Yehudim Laman Yeshua, which means Jews for Jesus on them. And we were handing out gospel tracts to the Jews, and for the longest time I was praying that the Lord would let me witness to a king. And I was not specific about who that king would be. And so the Lord answered the prayer that day. The president of Israel was there. And he was there for a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a bike race for Arab and Jewish kids. So I went right under the security fence, and I walked right up to him, and I gave him the New Testament, and I told him the gospel with my mouth, and he took it. So you never know. Be careful what you pray for. Okay, now, what's your name again? Christine, that's right. Christine has brought some Jerusalem stone with her. And this is Cenomanian limestone with a C. And this is what that hill country is made of. You know, Hebron and Bethlehem and stuff. It looks just like this. And this is the stuff that's good for building. It's good for water retention. It's good for building terraces. It's good for roads, etc. Now, this stone, you could see the width of it, right? This was the typical stone that from 1917 to 1947 that the British instructed that your house be at least faced with. Okay, so the wall would be concrete, right? But you just kind of glue these on the front, right? Like a puzzle. Okay, so this is it. Okay, when this is exactly from, I would say it's recent because of the back of it, right? This looks like a modern tool that was used. But maybe, I don't know. Who knows? It's fun to ponder, you know. Yep. But anyways, if you want to see that during break, you could. I'll just leave it, or she'll leave it up here, and right. Okay, so there's our Tel Lachish, the second most important site in all of Judah during the Kingdom Age. That's what it would have looked like at the eve of its destruction in 701 BC by the Assyrians. Now, at this time, the Assyrians were the cats. They were the superpower of the world. So for Nahum to write a book that says Nineveh is going to be destroyed would be like in the 1980s saying that America is going to be 100% wiped off the map. That's impossible. I mean, we're the superpower of the world, you know. But anyways, that's what came to pass. And at this time, this is 701 BC, the end days of the Assyrian Empire. They come into Israel, and we're going to look at a piece of archaeological evidence later called the Sennacherib cylinder, but it tells us that he took 46 cities in Judah. The Bible doesn't tell us that, so it adds some more color to the picture, so to speak. And this is what the city would have looked like when he destroyed it. Now, there's different ways to destroy a city in antiquity. You could either flood it, if it's by a strong enough river, like in Nahum chapter 2. It says that the gates of the river were opened and the palace was destroyed. Okay, I think it's like verse 8 or something of chapter 2, something like that. So you can flood it. Number 2, you can burn it, like Hatzor. Actually, the word in Hebrew for burning Hatzor is Shoah, which is the word for Holocaust, which is a whole burnt offering. Okay, which is interesting. It was a whole burnt offering to God, the city of Hatzor was. Okay, number 3, which is the least favorable way, is you can starve it out. You can siege it. And, for example, Gaza, which, by the way, the word Gaza, it literally means strong. Okay? And Gaza was so strong that Joshua couldn't take it. Neither could David. Okay? The only reason Solomon took it was because of a political marriage. Okay? So Gaza withstood Alexander the Great for 3 years. Okay? Primarily, their food didn't run out because they're next to the sea and they could get fish, etc. Okay? Number 4, you could use instruments of war, like battering rams and stuff. By the way, when you would attack a city with bow and arrow, what you would do is you would, especially during the Greek-Roman period, you would inscribe your name on the arrowhead. Why? Because, any ideas? Yeah, whoever kills the king or something, and it was John, right? John gets $100 raise or something like that. Okay, it makes sense too. Okay, that's what that. Anyways, so at Lachish, in order to take this city, they had to build a siege ramp. Now, Lachish was the last city that was taken in Judah before they attempted Jerusalem. Okay, and they figured the only way that they could take the city is to build a ramp. So remember, they have taken 46 cities before this, and the the Assyrians were kind of like the inventors of the rudimentary form of crucifixion. Okay, so what they would do is they would take the sheiks, or the village leaders all around, and they would make them human flags, kebabs. Okay, and so they would use that scare tactic to hopefully have the city not rebel, but just submit to their yoke. And then once they submitted to their yoke, the men became slaves, and the men would go in and around Lachish and get field stones, okay? And they would take these field stones and then bring them over here and build the ramp. See the ramp right here? Okay. Oh, excuse me, that's not the ramp. That's the archaeological dump. The ramp's right here, I'm sorry. Okay, so the men on top are not going to shoot arrows down because your cousin is the one building the siege ramp. Okay, it's very smart. So what do? You can do nothing. You just got to sit and wait and die, unless you want to start shooting your cousin. Okay, some of my cousins I would shoot, but no, that's a different. No, I'm just kidding. Nevertheless, that's what's left. This is natural right here, and then this is artificial. That's all that's left. But that's the only portion of an Assyrian siege ramp that's left in the world. Okay? Now, the king at this time, his name was Sennacherib, and his capital was Nineveh, and inside his palace he had a mural or a display that's as long approximately as this wall right here and about half the height, and it showed his great conquering adventures in the ancient Near East. And guess what? Was found there in the late 1900s. That's Lachish. This is the ramp. Those are the instrument of war, Assyrian soldiers, Jews falling down. Right? Extra biblical sources that prove the 100% truth of God's word. There are over 60 different persons in the Old Testament who we have found archaeological evidence concerning them. And there's over 30 in the New Testament. Okay? Not once has it ever been wrong. Okay? Let's talk about this place right here called Bet Shemesh. Bet means house. Shemesh is from the root of the sun, so it means something like the house of the sun god or something like that. Now, Bet Shemesh is located on the seam of the hill country where these guys are, right? We talked about. And the Shephelah, where these guys are, right on the seam. Okay, and since it's on the seam, it's like 660 feet above sea level, and then boom, this 3,000 feet above sea level climb. Okay, and Bet Shemesh, therefore, is located in what would be the equivalent, if they were going the same way, of a 299 and a 36 or a 44 or something like that. Two major intra-regional routes. And because of that, there's been tons of activity here. Here's what it looks like on today's map. Okay, it's located about a day's walk west of Jerusalem. Nevertheless, we have remains there going all the way back to what's called the Bronze Age. We have early Bronze Age, which is generally speaking about 2,100 to about 1,700. Then we have Middle Bronze Age, which is approximately 1,700 to about, say, 1,500. Then you have Late Bronze Age, which is 1,500 to 1,200 BC. Okay, each of those Bronze Ages, right, had tremendous civilization here. And the reason there's so much civilization here is because of its location. It's like at the crosshairs. Therefore, that. Now, one thing I do want to mention about this site, its connection with Samson. It says in the Bible that Samson's family moved from the hill country, which is right up here, to a place called Zorah. Okay? Zorah is a sister city of Bet Shemesh. If you're standing on Bet Shemesh, this bald mountain top right here, see that? That's Zorah. Now, if we look on a map, what we see is that Zorah is on the other side of the tracks. That means that Samson's father, that's who Samson probably got what they call his shugana from, or his chutzpah, his craziness from, so to speak, because his dad said, look, God gave us all this land. We're going to get out of the hill country where all of Israel is living in the mice holes, and we are going to start taking back the land God has given us. And so what does he do? He comes out of the hill country, crosses over the tracks, and goes into the Shephelah and sets up camp in Zorah. And that word for camp in Hebrew is something like pup tents, like just a rudimentary camp, right? Okay. So when we put the map next to the text and we find out where these cities are, it reveals some possible information about the persons in the text. And Samson's name in Hebrew is Shimshon, which is the same root as Shemesh, and they mean sunlight. Okay? So you have to wonder, how close did Samson's parents, and it doesn't mention his mother's name, interestingly. His father's name is Manoah, which means, Ma means what, and Noah means comfort or rest. So he says, what comfort or what rest? Or i.e., I'm living under some really hard times here, politically and economically and religiously. What rest? Right? Well, his son was the rest. But nevertheless, you have to wonder how close they really followed Yahweh, because their son is named after a sun deity that lived next door. Right? And by the way, Delilah, the root of her name, Lila, is night. So you have light and darkness, literally. Right? Okay? Nevertheless, that's Bet Shemesh. Let's move to the Philistine coastal plain. The word Philistine, well, look. In 137 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian renamed the land of Israel Palestine. Now, remember, there's no vowels in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew. So if you take out all the vowels of Philistine and all the vowels of Palestine, it's the same word. Okay? And by renaming the land of Israel Palestine, it was renaming it after their arch rival. It's the greatest insult you could possibly do. Okay? Nevertheless, the Philistine coastal plain, the Philistines entered into the land of Israel about 1300 or 1200 BC, the time of the judges. And their territory was from Gaza in the south to Jaffa in the north. Okay, about 30 miles or so long, and about 15 or 20 miles or so wide. Very, very small. Now, within that, here's Gaza today. By the way, Gaza to Ashkelon is only 13 miles, and Gaza to Ashdod's about 20 miles. Okay, and they do have rockets that can easily hit both those cities, and they have hit both those cities. Okay. In Ashkelon, 100,000 Jews live in Ashkelon. Okay? Basically, you see Sderot right there? Sderot has been hit with 10,000 rockets over the last 10 years. Okay? You live with your car windows rolled down. You live with the TV volume down. Okay? And you have to always be ready to get into the bomb shelter. I don't know what the odds are, but what's 10,000 rockets a day over 10 years? I mean, that's like a lot. Okay? The schools have missile-proof roofs over them for the playgrounds. All the bus stops are rocket-proof. This is their world. And so they had enough. The straw finally broke, and then in December 2008, January 2009, Israel entered in here. Very dangerous because it's all urban warfare. The soldiers, Hamas, does not wear uniforms. They shoot their rockets from mosques and schools. Okay? And so that's why 1,500 Palestinians died. Innocent civilians. Okay, some of them weren't so innocent. But anyways, 1,500 died. Okay? And they're going to go back in here sooner or later because it hasn't stopped. I mean, what would you do if someone shot 10,000 rockets on you over 10 years? I mean, would you really wait 10 years to finally go in and clean house? I mean, but they did. Nevertheless, ancient Gaza has not been excavated, and that's because, once again, of its continual occupancy. But the reason Gaza is so important when we think of the land of the Bible, not only is it one of the 5 Philistine cities, the Pentapolis, but Gaza was located at the corner of 5 and 80. Okay? The Great Spice Route, which Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, right? Well, the Great Spice Route is 1492 miles long. Okay. You know how we have Route 66, get your kicks? Well, the Spice Route has 66 stops, just like Route 66 along the way, right? Gaza was the last and final stop. Okay? The strong. Then from Gaza, all of those gold, myrrh, frankincense, all these goodies, these top shelf luxury items, among other things, were then shipped out to the known world from Gaza. Okay? That's why Gaza is so important, because of its location. Okay? Not only it is on that main land route connecting Egypt to Babylon, but it's on that spice route. It's the terminal, the port for the spice route. Okay? Now, just north of Ashkelon, like we mentioned, about 10, 13 miles of Gaza is Ashkelon, mentioned in the Bible many times. Ashkelon means literally to weigh something. The word shekel comes from Ashkelon. By the way, about 10 years ago, the dollar, it was 5 shekels for $1, and today it's 3 shekels for $1. Nevertheless, Gaza was much more important than Ashkelon because Ashkelon was astride or off of the main international highway. Therefore, it didn't get as much press or as much trade or whatever. Okay? But nevertheless, when archaeologists dug here, they found, number one, in the hill country, you're going to make your house of Cenomanian limestone like that. Here, you have to make it of mud-dried brick, unless you're filthy rich and you can import all the stone. So, look at this is 3,500 years old, and it's held up pretty good. Okay? Nevertheless, this arch gate right here was one of 2 arch gates that have been found in Israel. Up until 100 years ago, experts, whoever they are, said Romans invented the arch gate, and this was invented 1,500 years earlier. Anyways, this would be the way into the city, and the sea, like many cities in Israel, is oriented towards who or what it's catering. They're catering not the Highway 5, because they're off it too far. They're catering the sea. Trade. Okay? Now, right outside of this city was found a sanctuary, a temple, because this is one of the 5 Philistine cities. Remember, the Pentapolis cities was found a sanctuary of the golden calf or Baal. So when you read your Bible and you come across Baal or Baal, that's who you should imagine. That's what he looked like. Okay? Now we'll talk more about Baal or Baal worship later, but more often than not, he would fit into the palm of your hand. And I would say, generally speaking, every single house in Israel in the north had that above the equivalent of a fireplace or in the corner to worship. By the way, more idols have been found in Jerusalem than any other city in all of Israel. Okay? And one of the main reasons is when Solomon married 700 wives and princesses and had 300 concubines, that princess would bring with her an embassy. And not only would she bring an embassy, she would bring her cult system. She would actually bring the physical earth or dirt from her home country and put that inside of her temple in Jerusalem so she could pray to her God on her home turf. And then all these gods start pouring in. About 30 years ago, an archaeologist was visiting at his friend's house in the north in Samaria, and he saw that on the fireplace. He said, "Where did you get that?" He said, "Oh, I'll show you. It was just laying about a mile away from his house on the top of a hill. Just laying on the ground, and I picked it up." So what they did is they started taking away the earth. And what did they find? They found what the Bible called a high place. And a high place would be a high place, and then that area would be surrounded by stones, like that would look like a necklace or an oval, okay? And they could be, depending on the stones, as high as you wanted them to be. And then within that high place, depending if it was like on the corner of like First and Main, or if it was right in Shingletown, would be how big of a palace or a cult center you would have to worship there. And there would often be trees there and etc. Okay, but that's on our mind's eye what we should think of when we think of a high place in the Bible. Okay, nevertheless, there's Baal. That's a view of Ashkelon today. Ashkelon does not have a natural port. As you can see, the whole coast of Israel does not have a real natural port. There's a little bit of a bump at Jaffa. Okay, and Jaffa was the main port city for Jerusalem. Okay, which we'll get to later. But the only legitimate port is Haifa or Akka, which we'll talk about later. Nevertheless, when we think of Ashkelon, let's think of that, right? An hour off the main highway, sea-oriented, high place for Baal worship. Shekel, weight, it's very rich. They're the largest dog cemetery in all of antiquity was found in Ashkelon. So they had something like 600,000 dogs were found buried there. Some kind of cultic Roman-ish dog worship took place there. Port city par excellence. Okay? Let's think of that when we read our Bibles in Ashkelon. Jaffa is actually a Phoenician word, Yafo, which means beautiful, and that it is. It is most famous for the story of Jonah. By the way, Jonah's name means dove, and that he's not a very dovish person, but anyways, that's what his name means. Anyways, Yafo is the natural port, if there is such a one, for Jerusalem. So when they're building the temple, Hiram, king of Tyre, made a deal with Solomon and David, right? They'd cut down the timber up north in Lebanon. Then they would put it on a beast, drag it to Tyre or Sidon, okay? Put it into the sea, wrap it with ropes. I don't think they had chains at that time. Hook it onto the boat, float them down the sea. Then you bring them to Jaffa. Once you get to Jaffa, then you put them on the beasts, and the beasts bring them up about 30 to 40 miles uphill to Jerusalem to build the temple. That's the idea. Okay? Big deal. There's the port of Jaffa today. It's a man-made port right there. Okay? All these buildings you see here are from the Ottoman period, 1517 to 1917. But Jaffa goes way, way back. I mean, there's Egyptian remains here from 1500 BC of a guy named Thutmose III, who we'll talk about later. There's just phenomenal remains here with Egyptian influence all the way down until today. Because of Jaffa's location, Jaffa functioned as, right here there's a triangle that goes like that, okay? And Aphek, Lod, and Jaffa. And that triangle right there, the land is naturally lifted up. And this plain is spoken of in the book of Nehemiah, the Aphek, Lod, Jaffa triangle. It's called the Plain of the Craftsmen. And it was probably remembered as the area where the Philistines used to blacksmith. And it's also called the Plain of Ono, O-N-O. Okay? And the reason that there was so much activity there is because that triangle was a perfect staging ground for an army. Because it's out of the swamps, etc., and it can give you then, boom, direct access up into the hill country where Jerusalem is. Okay? But since Jaffa's one of those three pegs, it was always an important site throughout history. Right? Okay? Let's go to the Negev. When we think of the land of the Bible, north is wet, south is dry, west is wet, east is dry. North is wet, south is dry, west is wet, east is dry, generally speaking. Negev literally means south. It's first mentioned in Genesis chapter 12. Now, the Negev today is this area right here. It's huge, okay? But when the Bible mentions the Negev, it's not talking about the modern day Negev at all. The biblical Negev looks like a sideways number 8 or a bow tie. And it's 30 miles long or wide. In the middle of that bow tie, or that sideways number 8, is Beersheba. Okay? Beersheba. The eastern, think of a number 8 like this, right? So Arad would be the easternmost extremity, which we'll show pictures of later, of the Negev. And then Gerar, which is by Sarah, would be the westernmost extremity of the Negev. Okay? That's the biblical Negev. So that great spice route we've been talking a lot about, right, which is 1492 miles long, which starts in Yemen and Oman, well, the second to last stop is Beersheba. Okay? Then when you turn around and come home, by the way, this takes at least 3 months, this route of 1492 miles, at least 3 months. Okay, but it makes you filthy rich. Okay? At least 3 months. But the key is to knowing where the water is. Okay? And that's what the Nabateans were very good at. Anyways, when you came home, one of the first stops you would hit is this place called Avdat. It's not mentioned in the Bible, but it's a Nabatean city. Nabateans came to the cream of the crop about, we'll say about 150 or so BC. Okay? And they built this city called Avdat. You see this paved road right here? Well, that's paved on top of where that spice route would have went. Okay? Unless you want to drill through mountains, the lay of the land kind of demands that where the roads were in antiquity is where they go today. Okay? So, because of Avdat's location, guarding one of the 66 stops on the main route, it became then inherited after the Romans by the Byzantine Church, and today there's the remains of 324 to 640 AD. Okay? But let's talk about Beersheba. Now, this is a picture of what Beersheba would have looked like during the time of the kings. We're talking David down to Babylon. Okay? That's it. Not very big. It's big, but it's not crazy big. Now, if we were to zoom in on that, we would see what the average Israelite house would have looked like. Now, burial and dwelling places change with time in Israel. And from the time of David until the time of Babylon, this is what your average house would have looked like. It's called a 4-room house, and it parallels the temple of God. Let me explain. You see room number 4 all the way in the back. Okay? That is the master bedroom, or the Holy of Holies. I do not walk into your house and just go straight for the master bedroom, do I? And sit down on the bed. It's forbidden. Okay? So it would be in this house. By the way, all the family would sleep together. That's why in the parable, when the guy who comes to the other guy's house at midnight and knocks on the door, right, his whole family has to be woken up because everyone sleeps on top of each other. Okay? Nevertheless, then rooms 2 and 3 would be for, depending on the time of the year, you'd have the sheep and goat inside to act as a furnace. Okay? And to cook and to clean and to bake and et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And then the walls would go up, a good 6-8 foot, and most of these houses would have a second story. And all the houses in the time of the Bible are flat on the roof, or they have a slight pitch to catch the water. There is none of this. Okay? And then room number 1 would be the room that is, in the Midwest, we have something called a porch, right? Right? That would be the equivalent thereof. Okay? The door would always remain open at daylight. Okay? And then at nighttime it's locked. Okay? Now the wall behind the master bedroom is one of 2 kinds of walls in a city. You would either have what's called a casemate wall or a solid wall. Solid wall, they could range in thickness, and where we think, we'll show it later, but where we think Sodom is today, their walls are 20 feet thick. Okay? Now your average city at this time, they're about 4 to 6, 8 foot thick. But this is what's called a casemate wall. It's a lot cheaper to build, and it's very user-friendly. So you'd have a wall about 2 or 3 foot thick, then you have a big space between it, maybe about 6 foot or so, right, that people could walk in. And then you'd have another 2 to 3 foot thick wall. Okay, then if you're going to be invaded, you fill that really quick with dirt or sand or field stones or something. But then in the meantime, people would live in between there. And so when it says like Rahab lived on the wall of the city, well, that means she lived in a casemate wall. Okay? Nevertheless, the house, right, like the Holy of Holies, and then you have, right, where the bread and the candlestick are in the house and in God's house, and then you have like the courtyard here. It's just kind of a reflection of the house of God. So God, the tabernacle, the temple is warm. It's inviting people, right, to fellowship, to commune with him. So that's your average house. Okay, guys? That's what the city looked like above during the time of the kings. Okay? And look, there is not one shred of archaeological evidence that Abraham ever existed. Okay? And that's fine. We don't expect there to be. When Napoleon's army in 1799 invaded Israel, which they did, they went all the way from Egypt through Israel, all the way up to Akko, to Haifa. There is not one shred of archaeological evidence that Napoleon was ever in Israel. And that was 200 and plus years ago. That's it. Why? Because they lived in tents. The soldiers did. So why would you expect to find evidence from 4,000 years ago of someone who lived in a tent? It's not going to happen. But what we do have is we have remains from the time of Abraham. And this is one of them. This is the well at Beersheba. By the way, this wall is from the time of the kings. The bottom layer right here is of field stones. Okay, send the kids, the young men, out to the field, bring them all in. The top is sun-dried mud brick. Now this is reconstructed. This trough right here is reconstructed, just to give you an idea of what it would have looked like, right? But the well right here is from the time of Abraham, for sure. And the reason we know that is because at the bottom of the well there is broken pottery, right, and layers, and that pottery dates from the time of Abraham. Let's continue with a very interesting place called Arad. Remember, Arad is the easternmost extremity of the Negev. It's about 17 miles east of Beersheba. And Arad, as you can see from the map, right, Hebron forks into 2 roads, one to Arad and one to Beersheba. Right? Arad's the terminal for one of those routes. And this is the Israelite fortress from the time of the kings. Okay? David down to Babylon. Now what we have found here is very interesting. We have found in Arad the only known or discovered temple in Israel. Okay? We've never found the temple in Jerusalem. We have the Temple Mount, but we've never found the temple. So you'd have to say, first of all, the Bible says that there should only be a temple in Jerusalem. Why is there a temple in Arad? I mean, you have an altar here, which would probably have 4 horns on it. You have the courtyard. You have a Holy of Holies right there. And inside that Holy of Holies are 2 standing stones. And you have 2 incense burners or pillars, like in Jerusalem. Well, as a footnote, these standing stones, when Moses came down from Sinai, the stones he was carrying, if they're like any other stone from that time that Egyptians used to write their laws on, it was the size of the palm of your hand and the thickness of the palm of your hand. Okay, not those big guys that Charlton Heston's carrying down. Okay? And the reason that, look, it was the custom of the ancient Near Easterns at that time to write the law of your God and then lay the law of your God at his feet. So what did the Israelites do? They put it inside the ark, which is the footstool of Yahweh, of the invisible God. Okay? Now, you see this line right here? See that? That line? That's called the reconstruction line. It was invented by an archaeologist named Yigal Yadin, who dug at Masada in 1967. And what it does is it gives us an idea of what it would have looked like up. So everything from the line down is original, and that is put back into place to give you an idea kind of what it would have looked like. Nevertheless, we don't know why this is here. We know this is a temple. We know it's Jewish. We know it's from the time of the kings. The Bible says that you shouldn't do this. They're doing it. You can only surmise why they're doing it. Okay, it's one of those 66 stops on the spice route. They're going to have tons of traffic, tons of people of different religion. It's going to be a lot of money coming in and out of here. A lot of gold, myrrh, frankincense, all these goodies. And they might have just compromised their faith to appease the travelers and for a source of revenue. Okay? But when this site was put down, and it was put down during the time of Josiah, probably by Josiah himself during his reforms. Very interestingly, not like Hatzor, where we find all of the destroyed idols, like the Bible says. These were very gently and quietly laid to rest and covered over with earth. It wasn't violently destroyed. It was revered as a holy place, even though it's still, right? It's an error. Very interesting. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Edom. This region right in here. Edom is called the fatness of the earth in the Bible. It's 6,000 feet above sea level, right? This is about 3,300. That's 6,000, okay? It's called Mount Seir, which means the hairy mountain, named after Esau, who's the hairy person. And the reason it's called the hairy mountain is because it's just filled with all these green little shrubs. Okay? Now, we talked a lot about that watershed ridge that connects, right, Hebron, Bethlehem, all the way to the north. Well, it had a sister route. We'll call it a 505 or something like that, okay? On the eastern side that ran through Edom and ended at the port city of Aqaba. Now, this route on the eastern side is in the Bible called the King's Highway in the Bible. And the King's Highway connected Edom, Moab, Ammon, Gilead, Bashan with Damascus. Damascus is called the Eye of the East because of its physical setting. Okay? If you want to take that Highway 5, right, you got to go through Damascus. The land forces you. Mount Hermon forces you to go through, so Damascus has always been rich. Okay? Nevertheless, when Abraham comes from Ur of the Chaldees into the land of Canaan, he stops at Haran, and Haran, it literally means in Genesis 11, it means crossroads, which is like 5 and 80, right there, Sacramento. Okay? Nevertheless, this is the King's Highway, and this is the route the Israelites would have taken when they were destroying the kings on the eastern side of the Jordan, right? Moses was their leader, right? That's the route, the King's Highway. Okay? Okay. Let's talk about the capital momentarily. Before Petra of Edom, it was called Basra. This is mentioned in the book of Obadiah. And Basra is about 5,600 feet above sea level, and it's fortified on every single side except this spur right here by deep V-shaped canyons. You cannot attack this place. That's why in Obadiah he says, "O thou that has the nest set amongst the stars, whose habitation is high, that saith in his heart, Who shall bring me down to the ground? Though thou exalt thyself as the eagle," etc., etc., etc. So when we can see a picture of it and then read the text with it, we can say, wow, okay, that really makes sense now. Because it's high and lifted up like a giant eagle perched. Okay? So this is the capital of Edom during the time of the Bible. Okay? And it's located right off, as you could see, just astride that King's Highway. Okay? Right away from the King's Highway. Now, here's a map of what the New Testament capital looked like, and this is Petra. Okay? Now, Petra is very famous. Not only was it in the last crusade, but it's now become a wonder of the world. And the Sikh, this is called S-I-K-H, has been widened over antiquity. But the first century Roman geographer, whose name was Strabo, said that you had to go through it this way, like side to side. Okay? And he said it was carved with a man's hand, the entrance to the city. Okay? So now you could fit probably 2 or 3 people across that but in antiquity you had to go that way. And the reason it is so fortified, because on every other side there's no way in or out, is because this was where the warehouse was for all of the Nabatean trade that's going from Yemen, Oman to Gaza. I mean, this is like Fort Knox. Okay? Hence the fortification. Okay? This is a Nubian sandstone carved into the rock face itself. This is the site from Indiana Jones, right? By the way, when you go in the front door here, the inside of the building is no bigger than this room. Okay? Anyways, superstitious Bedouin or Arabs thought that these stone urns contained gold, and so they shot most of them or have destroyed most of them. But nevertheless, that is still 2,000 plus years old. Not bad. A little bit about Moab. Moab is the son of one of the two daughters of Lot. In Genesis 19, the firstborn bare a son and called his name Moab, and the younger Ben-ammi, and that is the father of the children of Ammon unto this day. So after that account in Genesis 19, it appears that happened over here probably, that Lot and his two daughters moved a little bit east, and then they started their civilizations there. Nevertheless, Moab, I want to show you this site called Dibon. Now right here would be where that King's Highway is. So Dibon is right off the King's Highway. And Dibon, when you read the Bible, you want to think of it as the Jerusalem of Moab. Okay? It's the capital city, the religious, the political, the administrative hub of all of Moab. Is Dibon. Okay? And we have remains there. These are from Iron Age 2 and Iron Age 1. Iron Age 2 is 12,000 to 1,000 BC, and Iron Age 1 is 12,000 to 100. Iron Age 2 is 1,000 to 586. And that's when the Babylonians come. But nevertheless, this is what's left of Dibon today from the Iron Age period. It's just a bunch of stones turned over that doesn't look like much. But at its time, this was the equivalent of Jerusalem in Moab. There's the walls. Okay. Now, something interesting was found here, and this is called the Mesha stele. This was found at Dibon in about 1876. What happened is that archaeology at this time was a baby, and it was more of a treasure hunting than anything else. And word reached some missionaries in Jordan that the Arabs had a really nice archaeological piece there. And this is called the stele or a stela, and they vary in height and width, but this one is about yay high and about yay wide, and it's made of black basalt stone. And this is from about 850 BC. Okay? And it's called the Mesha stela, because it's written by the scribes of Mesha from 2 Kings chapter 3. And it gives us tremendous information that helps fill in the cracks about the world of the Israelites and the Moabites at this time. Well, these missionaries got word that the Arabs had this, and one missionary named Claremont Francis Gounod went down and said, I'll give you X amount of dollars for this. And they said, sure. So he goes to get the money, and by the time he gets back, so-and-so offered them 3 times as much. So the superstitious Bedouins think there's gold inside, so they make a big fire, and they dig a pit, and they throw the stone in the pit on top of the fire, and then they dump cold water on it to break it, to get the gold out. Well, right before this happened, Gounod jumped in the pit and made a wax copy of it, okay, and jumped out of the pit by the skin of his teeth and escaped. And many years later, so they had a complete copy of it, and then many years later they were able to piece together from collectors the different pieces of the stela, okay. Nevertheless, Mount Nebo and Medeba. Now, whenever anyone attacks Israel from the east, they always attack from what's called the Medeba Plateau. This is the launching, Jericho would be right there. This is the launching pad from the east into Israel. Of course, Mount Nebo is where Moses was buried. Now, you know how we have Mount Sinai, but Mount Sinai is a chain of mountains, and then within that chain is Mount Oreb, and that's where the law was given. Same thing with Mount Nebo. Mount Nebo is a chain, and within Mount Nebo in Deuteronomy 34, there's a place called Pisgah, and at Pisgah is where Moses was buried. Okay? But Medeba is the launching pad into Israel. Now, there was a church here from the time of Justinian, which is 6th century AD, and we have here inside the church on the ground a mosaic, which is a map of the Holy Land, which is the oldest map of the Holy Land we have in the world. And this is 600 AD. And in this map, which is Byzantine, late Byzantine period, you have the Dead Sea here, and ships on them, probably carrying salt or some kind of grain, but probably salt. You have the Jordan River connecting to it, which doesn't exist today. Jericho, Gilgal over here, Jerusalem, okay, Gath, okay, etc. So this gives us an insight into the world of the land of the Bible in 1400 years ago. Very fascinating. Let's continue real quick with Ammon. Ammon is a very small territory located right here, about 15 miles wide and about 10 miles longer. So the only reason this place is important is because that Highway 505 runs right through it. Okay? This region in the time of the Bible was highly forested, and the only cities that were here were right off that King's Highway. Okay? But the capital city, Rabat Ammon, that's where Uriah the Hittite met his death. Okay? Nevertheless, the Dead Sea, the biblical name for the Dead Sea is the Sea of Salt in Genesis 14, and it's called the Sea of Arabah in Deuteronomy 3:17. Okay? It's not called the Dead Sea until the 2nd century and the 3rd century AD by Greco-Roman writers. Okay? The Dead Sea is bounded on the east by Moab, Edom, etc. On the south, this is called the Arabah, or the Jordan rift that reaches all the way into Africa. On the west, it's bounded by the wilderness of Judah. And then on the north is the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley, if you do things right, you can get over 10 alfalfa cuts a year. Okay? Sometimes 14. Okay? But we'll talk more about that later. Nevertheless, the Dead Sea is divided into two parts. Separating them is what's called the lisan, or the tongue, the lisan. This area is about 30 miles long and about 10 miles wide. This one about 15 miles long and about 10 miles wide. The reason the Dead Sea is shrinking so much is, number one, this region gets 2 inches of rain a year. But that's not a big deal because remember the wadis are carrying the water down from the watershed ridge into here. But number one, those are being dammed not only on Israel's side, but 100% on Jordan's side because Jordan has no water. There's no natural body of water there. All your rain comes from either rain or desalinized water, recycled water. So they're catching all of the rain in these wadis before it hits the Dead Sea. So the Dead Sea is shrinking at tremendous rates. And within 50 years, the Dead Sea will not be totally dry, but it'll get to a point where it can no longer decrease. Okay? It's 62% water and 38% minerals. It's 10 times saltier than salt water. And it's beautiful on one hand, right? Very beautiful. But don't be deceived. I mean, you can float in it, but the number one cause of death in the Dead Sea is drowning. Because people get away from the lifeguards. You have, right, over 320 days a year of hot sun beating on your head. You're not used to it. You zonk out for a minute or something. You do one of these, and now you have something 10 times saltier than salt water in mass amounts in you. And you die. Okay? Nevertheless, the main route of traffic in the time of the Bible always went on the west side of the Dead Sea. Okay? Because that's where the main route goes to the main place. Because on the east side, where the Dead Sea and the mountains begin, there's no take. There's no room to drive chariots up and down, or really even to walk comfortably. But on the west side, there's tremendous room to do that. And on the west side, you have the only place, which we'll talk about later, En-Gedi, that has fresh water. Okay? There are brackish springs around the edges of it, but it still contains like 5 to 10% salt water. You can't drink it. Okay? Nevertheless, here's Masada. Okay? Masada is the second of the 5 fortresses that Herod the Great built. The other one in the region is called Machaerus, which is about right there. Okay? So when John was baptizing up here, he could probably see the place where he would eventually go. Okay? So Masada is actually, it's probably mentioned in Genesis 14. It says when the kings of the north invaded Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and those kings, that the survivors went to the mountain. Now, in this region, there's a lot of mountains, but there's not many places that are isolated that could be called the mountain. And it's a perfect place to go. Look at, the reason you go to this region is to become not connected. You go to hide, like David, which we'll talk about later. It's a fragmented area. And so you could see how those kings would go to that very easily. Okay? This is this top of this. It kind of looks like a pirate ship, the top of it, like a deck. And so the deck, when they did surveys, they found pottery from the time of David. Okay? But it really didn't start to get built up until the time of the intertestamental period by the Hasmoneans. Okay? But Herod the Great is the one who turned it into something really special. I mean, you're talking 2 inches of rain a year here, okay? He has, first of all, he built really high walls so the locals could not look in. So the superstition, the mystery of the place would grow, because they all knew that inside there was a bathtub, a huge bathtub, a swimming pool for that matter, of fresh water. There was a cistern that held 100,000 gallons plus of fresh water. Okay? You had a synagogue. You had just the creme de la creme. And from a distance, it looked like it was marble. It wasn't marble. It was, he kind of just took the stone, and his artist put like stucco and molded and kind of shaped it to look like marble pillars. Right? But from a distance, you would think, wow, it's even made of marble. And marble comes from way overseas. So it was just one of those over-the-top places that he would have. I mean, they found pickled apples there, and they found a synagogue, and in the synagogue there was a text that had Ezekiel 37 in it, the Valley of Dry Bones. Okay? They would have crops up here. I mean, basically it was the Ritz. But anyways, the site, as most of you know, was taken over by the Jewish rebels during the Jewish revolt after AD 70. And as the story goes, take it for what it's worth, every single Jew committed suicide on top except 3 instead of being handed over to the Romans. This is a Roman base that still exists today, right outside of Masada. Okay? Where the soldiers the soldiers had to spend years and years and years to attack this place because they had to build a siege ramp here too. Okay? So they were not going to let these Jews survive because, they've been like 3-4 years trying to take Masada. When we get in, you're all dead. Okay? So they just killed themselves instead. Okay? Nevertheless, if you go on this main route on this western side, there's only one place to stop that has drinking water. And that is En-Gedi. Now, let's pause real quick, take a 10-minute break, and we'll come with our last session before lunch.